Hi, everybody. Welcome to English Digest. I'm Tom.
I'm Stephanie.
And today we're going to actually talk about punk rock, which you may have heard of, and maybe some of you are fans of this. This goes way back before nowadays, at least 40 years ago or so. I remember it was
40, really?
I don't know the exact count, actually. Forgive me. My mathematics skills are pretty bad. But I do remember it when I was a kid that it was popular in the late 70s and part of the early 80s. And then punk rock kind of went underground, and then it became new wave music, which later faded out. But I think punk is actually still around.
I think you're right. It's not my favorite kind of music, but it's a style that's been around for a long time. And I think it's good to learn about all different kinds of styles of music. That's my opinion. But we're going to be talking about the punk rock revolution. You know that when we have a revolution, guys, it's when big changes happen. We use it officially to talk about overthrowing your government. Or maybe you're changing the way your society works, your social order, we could say. You're trying to change that, but it's usually a big change, a revolution. And if you engage in that revolution, you're a revolutionary. Yeah. That's not just an adjective. That can be a noun for people. A person is a revolutionary. Before we get started, though, guys, we're going to read through our article, kind of describe somebody who engages in punk rock music. It could be punk rock. I hear a lot, too, punk rock. So let's get started, guys. We're going to read through the article, and then we'll be back, and maybe we'll even play a little punk music.
A man with spiked hot pink hair stands on stage wearing ripped jeans, a nose ring, and a crude t-shirt held together with safety pins. He screams into a microphone while beside him another man with a green mohawk loudly thrashes the same 3 chords on a colorful guitar. This is punk rock at its finest. The punk rock movement emerged on both sides of the Atlantic in the early 1970s. The scene was rooted in the music, with bands such as the Ramones, the Clash, and the Sex Pistols leading the way. Punk music turned its back on the elaborate guitar solos and harmonies of rock music at the time, focusing instead on short, fast, and simple songs, bursting with raw energy and confrontational attitude. The music was intrinsically linked with punk fashion, which was popularized in London by Sex, a clothing store owned by the Sex Pistols manager. In New York City, meanwhile, singer Richard Hell of Television was the first to spike his hair, cut up and draw on his t-shirts, and use safety pins to hold his clothing together. Another characteristic of punk music was its lyrical focus on social and political issues. Singers frequently railed against the establishment. More than this, however, punk was an expression of individual freedom. Joe Strummer of The Clash stated it best when he said, "Punk rock is meant to be our freedom. We're meant to be able to do what we want to do." Punk rock has continued to influence musicians ever since the 1970s. Though some bands have moved more toward the mainstream, punk is at heart an underground do-it-yourself movement in which bands record, produce, and distribute their own albums. The spirit has evolved, but it refuses to die, and new generations of punk musicians will undoubtedly continue to emerge.
Okay, guys, let's look at the first paragraph. It's kind of fun. You can use your imagination as we describe someone who is involved with punk rock music. Okay, so this man has spiked hot pink hair, and he's standing on the stage. If your hair is spiked, it means you've combed it straight up. It's been cut pretty short. It can't be long and still be spiked. It's pretty, I think 1 to 3 inches, and you put something on it so it's really stiff and your hair just stands straight up. That's spiked hair. He also has ripped jeans. Those are still popular, though, today. They have nothing to do with punk rock. They've been popular forever. But ripped jeans, you know, just holes torn in them. Sometimes people buy new jeans and then rip them up before they've worn them once just to look cool. Those are ripped jeans. It's got a nose ring in the middle of his nose and a crude t-shirt held together with safety pins. Crude means it's kind of messy, kind of of sloppy. It's held together with safety pins instead of sewn together with a needle and thread or a sewing machine. Safety pins are those little pins that have the white head on the top that once you pin it, you hook it in that head. It's safety. It's a safety pin because it won't just come undone, you know. Most pins are straight. This has to go into that head and it keeps it tight and locked so you don't get yourself poked with it.
Yeah, they would use safety pins on cloth diapers. Nowadays, of course, most people use disposable diapers.
I would hope, yeah.
But if you use cloth diapers, of course, you're going to need those safety pins. Otherwise, the pins will be poking your little baby's skin and causing your baby to cry and stuff like that. So these are some examples of what punk rockers would wear. And you also have to remember that when punk rock first started, that was a pretty radical thing to do, to wear clothing like that. Ripped jeans, a nose ring, a t-shirt that's been ripped up, held together with safety pins. You see that stuff all the time in modern fashions. We just kind of go, ho-hum, there's that fashion again. But back then it was pretty radical here. But this is one way to describe punk rock. And what the singer is doing, he's screaming, ah, into a microphone. And then you've got another man who's got a green mohawk. He loudly thrashes the same 3 chords on a colorful guitar. Mohawk is a hairstyle that supposedly was popular among the Mohawk Indians of North America. I'm not sure how true that was, but they must have got the idea from someplace. They were kind of in eastern New York State, I guess, the Mohawk Indians. But in any case here, they had hairstyles like that. Maybe some of their chiefs did, I'm not sure. But if you thrash something, that means you kind of hit it kind of hard.
Repeatedly
with big, long strokes of your arm. But these are like 3 chords, maybe E, A, and D or something like that. Maybe bar F or something like that. But pretty much you've got some simple little chords there without any guitar solos and stuff like that.
Oh.
It's pretty raw stuff.
Yeah, a lot of yelling. I remember when I was going to school, I remember thinking, you know, how do you dance to this music? You don't really.
You just kind of hop and jump and bump into each other and
hop
stuff
around
like
and get a headache. So in the next paragraph, we're going to go on, and it says the punk rock movement emerged on both sides of the Atlantic in the early 1970s. The meaning of this on both sides of the Atlantic means Europe and North America, Canada, America. So this music came out in the early 70s. See, I don't remember it until later in the 70s. So the scene was rooted in the music. If something is rooted in something, it means that's where it began. That's its origin. So punk rock didn't come from fashion. Nope. It actually came from music. So they started with bands like the Ramones, very famous. The Clash, very famous. And the Sex Pistols leading the way. Sex Pistols because they had kind of a funky name.
Johnny Rotten, Sid Vicious, of course, those 2 notorious individuals. Johnny Rotten later went on to form Public Image Limited, but that's another story here. These bands are kind of the prototypes here. The Ramones, the Clash, the Sex Pistols, the New York Dolls, etc. They led the way. And punk music turned its back on the elaborate guitar solos and harmonies of rock music at the time, which kind of reminds me of the Eagles, actually.
Oh, really?
If you know the Eagles,
sure.
They kind of had these guitar solos, living it up at the Hotel California.
Not my favorite song, but yeah.
And they would have these guitar solos that were pretty elaborate, doing all sorts of things.
Because they were musicians.
They had practiced and studied and stuff like that. Anybody who could play 2 or 3 chords on a guitar could be a punk rocker.
Yeah.
And also some of these pop tunes in the 70s had harmonies, which means one person is singing the main line and then somebody sings something slightly lower or slightly higher, but they're in tune. They sound good together. Those are harmonies. You won't see any harmonies in punk rock unless it just happens to be the chords on a guitar. Those are automatically harmonized. But these guys would focus instead on short, fast, and simple songs, which were bursting with raw energy and confrontational attitude. I did say guys here, and it was mostly male, but there were some female punk rock bands as well, like Susie and the Banshees, etc. Those are some famous examples.
Okay.
But in any case, yes, indeed, they had short, fast, and simple songs. Yes, they were only about 2 minutes long or so.
Thank
then
goodness.
they jump into another song.
Yeah, because you get kind of tired jumping up and down. Okay, so they were also bursting with raw energy. There was a lot of energy to these songs. If something's bursting with something else, it means there's so much there, it's exploding, you know? Sometimes as we're recording and we're doing some of these lessons, Tom will burst into song. He'll just suddenly start singing for no reason. Or he's heard something that reminds him of a song.
Well, they always have to do with our content.
Oh, yes,
you know,
always.
So, yeah.
Although most of you probably have never heard of the songs that Tom sings. So these songs are bursting with raw energy. It's not controlled. It's just energy. And confrontational, if you confront somebody, you walk right up to them and you look like you want to fight with them. You're wrong. No, you're wrong. So some people do not like confrontational situations where they feel like they're fighting with somebody else. But that was the whole point of punk. You know, they were rebelling against the establishment, against contemporary society. They wanted to change everything.
Indeed, and I think the Sex Pistols were a notorious example of that, especially with their song God Save the Queen, which is kind of insulting to the Queen of England, and back at that time you just didn't do that. So that was pretty confrontational. That was a pretty bold thing of them to do, and other bands did other things as well. But you know something?
What?
We've arrived at the midpoint in today's lesson, so let's take a little bit of a break right now and listen to our Chinese teacher, and we'll be right back.
Hello everyone, my name is Tina. 我们今天要看的是庞克摇滚 The Punk Rock Revolution. 首先来看到第一个句子提到 A man with spiked hot pink hair stands on stage, wearing ripped jeans, a nose ring, and a crude t-shirt held together with safety pins. 这样子的装扮呢，很明显就是带着庞克摇滚风，尖刺状亮粉红色的头发，然后又穿着呢 ripped jeans 破损的牛仔裤，带着鼻环等等。那么有没有注意到它的主词是 a man 呢？而搭配这样的句意，第一题我们可以选择 A 选项。Sentence A 里面提到 He screams into a microphone while beside him another man with a green mohawk loudly thrashes the same 3 chords on a colorful guitar. 在这里的 he 主词呢，就是搭配前一句的 a man 打扮着庞克状的这个人呢，他对着麦克风尖叫着，而 beside him 在他身旁还有另外一个人，他有着这个绿色莫霍克头的男子呢，大声的呢猛刷着色彩鲜艳吉他上的3个和弦。在这里的 thrash 当作动词，有连续击打的意思，而这样子呢，我们就造就后面的文章的句子写着 This is punk rock at its finest. 从这样的描述就可以完整的叙述庞克摇滚的典范了。所以第一题搭配句意跟文意，我们标准答案就选择 A 选项。第二个空格后面的句子提到 The scene was rooted in the music, with bands such as the Ramones, the Clash, and the Sex Pistols leading the way. 有没有注意到在这里变成了一个过去式？如果你看完整段，这整段就是用来叙述庞克摇滚它的历史，所以呢我们就回到70年代，所以第二题我们可以选择 Sentence E. Sentence E 里面提到 The punk rock movement emerged on both sides of the Atlantic in the early 1970s. 其实呢，早期朋克摇滚的运动呢，是出现在1970年代大西洋的两岸。正是有这样的句子，所以后面的句子就讲到了，其实朋克呢，是以音乐为它的一个背景根源。那么后面提到的像是 The Ramones 还有 The Clash 以及The Sex Pistols 当时都是呢带头的有名的乐团。
We're going to take a quick break. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Welcome back, guys. We're talking about the punk rock revolution. A lot of people will just talk about punk music. If they're talking about punk, they're talking about punk rock, usually. So that was the revolution, and it came in the early 70s. We've talked about how some of these bands led the way, like the Ramones, the Clash, and the Sex Pistols. Were all those bands British? I know Sex Pistols were. The Ramones were, too.
I tend to think maybe 2/3 of the bands were British and 1/3 were American.
But these three in particular.
Yeah, the Ramones were American, but the Clash and the Sex Pistols were British. So there you go, 3-2.
I think the Brits really do punk rock really well.
Yeah, some American bands certainly can hold their own, but yeah, punk rock, I tend to think of the Brits as being the masters of it.
Me too, yeah.
But the Ramones were pretty good themselves, and so were the Dead Kennedys and the Dead Boys and X and bands like that. They were pretty good as well, but in any case, to each his own, oranges and lemons and
Everybody likes different things. So.
Exactly. Yeah. But in any case here, let's begin our part here by talking about the music and the fashion. The music was intrinsically linked with punk fashion, which basically means you can't really have one without the other, okay? If you have punk music, then you've got punk fashion. They exist at the same time. Intrinsic just means part of something. It's indispensable. You've got to have it. I could say that rock music or the guitar is indispensable with rock music. You just can't have rock music without a guitar.
You sure can. So the music was just a part of the whole thing. It was linked with this punk fashion. We described what punk fashion might look like. I think ripped jeans, no, they preceded punk in the 60s. The hippies had ripped jeans. But the rest of it, yeah, the different colored hair, the spikes, sometimes they wanted to look scary, I think. So the music and the punk fashion were really linked together. Both needed the other. And this was popularized in London by a clothing store actually called Saks in big pink capital letters. It was linked with punk fashion. Well, it was really where you'd go for a while to get your stuff. And it was actually owned by the Sex Pistols manager, not someone who you saw on stage perform. He wasn't part of the band. He was their manager. You never saw him.
Okay, so that's on the right side of the Pacific, I guess you could say it. So let's go across the big pond over to North America, to New York City. Meanwhile, going on there at the same time, we've got singer Richard Hell of Television. That was a famous punk band just simply called Television. Tom Verlaine was in that band. And this was the first person to spike his hair, which we described at the beginning of our article, someone with spiked hair. So Richard Hell was the person to do this first. He later went on to form his own band called Richard Hell and the Voidoids. But in any case, he was the first person to spike his hair. He was also the first person to cut up and draw on his t-shirts and then to use safety pins to hold his clothing together. So other punk bands followed suit. They did the same thing.
Interesting, yeah. Instead of just wearing real clothes, they wanted their clothes to look like they were falling off them, I guess. Now, here's the next paragraph. Another characteristic of punk music was its lyrical focus on social and political issues. Remember, we talked about them being revolutionary. Well, what were they rebelling against? Well, current society. The establishment is what we call it these days. People who are in power and who are generally the ones who are making decisions about our laws. So we're talking about politicians. We're also talking about people who have power because of their name. Maybe they own Amazon, or maybe they own Apple, or they're part of Apple. People who have power in the world, these are the ones that punk rockers are rebelling against. So a characteristic of something just means what something is like. Maybe a quality of something or a feature of something. So what's a quality of punk music? Well, they focused on lyrics, and the lyrics were anti-social and political issues of the day. Lyrical, of course, is the adjective for the word lyric, which are the words of a song. Lyrics.
Exactly. Exactly, the lyrics, and they would also have those songs talk about social issues, social injustice, stuff like that, and political issues of the time. I can't really think of any examples right now, but they were there. Singers frequently railed against the establishment. Here, the word rail as a verb just means you make a big noise about something, you complain about it, you mention it in a bad way. To rail against something, usually with that preposition to rail against, to say bad things about something, to complain about it, to criticize it. The establishment, of course, was the politicians who were in charge, companies and stuff like that. Just the
big corporations, huh?
Exactly. That's the establishment, what you're supposed to do. They would rally against that or rail against it and say, no, we're not going to do it that way. Things need to change.
Yeah, and it wasn't just complaining. It was like anger. There was a lot of anger to it. So more than, and that's kind of what the song sounded like. More than this, however, punk was an expression of individual freedom. I don't have to conform, which means you do what you're told. I'm not a conformist. I'm an individual, and I'm going to show my individuality. And you saw a lot of this in the clothes and things that people were doing. Joe Strummer of The Clash stated it best when he said, punk rock is meant to be our freedom. We're meant to be able to do what we want to do. We don't have to follow rules. We're going to say what we want, make up our own rules, make up our own music. And so that to them symbolized the freedom that was found with punk rock.
Unfortunately, Joe Strummer is no longer with us.
Maybe he used a little too much of that freedom in the wrong way.
Could be. You never know. But in any case here, he did have this famous quote about punk rock. And let's move on now to the final portion of our lesson for today. It does say here that punk rock has continued to influence musicians ever since the 1970s. And so, yes, indeed, you still hear songs by various punk bands in movies. I'm sure you've all heard of Blitzkrieg Bop before by the Ramones. That makes its way into movies all the time, as well as songs by the Clash and the Sex Pistols and Crass and the Damned, etc. Those songs continue to be played on airwaves all over the world. So it continues to influence musicians. They hear the music and then they come up with their own ideas. Punk is alive and well.
Yeah, I still hear a lot of it, actually. And I was telling Tom during a break that you hear it a lot in London. You know, if you go over to England, a lot of their radio stations that I would think are kind of the top 40 sort of thing. No, there's a lot of punk on that. I don't think we have as much punk in our music, in the U.S. at least. So
not as much, yeah.
Not as much? No, because there seem like every other fourth song is punk. Though some bands have moved toward the mainstream. Mainstream is you kind of blend in what most of society is liking and doing. But a lot of people who are revolutionaries, they don't want to blend in with the mainstream. But punk is at heart, this is kind of the basic, I guess, definition of what something is. At heart, what is it? You know, when you get down to the basics, it's an underground, do-it-yourself movement in which bands record, produce, and distribute their own albums. They're not going to be willing to work with these big record companies that actually tell the performers, the entertainers, what they can do and what they can't. Or they don't like that sound of the song. No, you got to rewrite that, got to change it. No. They never had to work with that because they actually would produce, record, and distribute their own albums.
Exactly. Of course, these concepts don't really apply anymore because everybody distributes their music on the internet, but you may still need to go through major record companies and stuff like that to make any money. But in any case, they record their own albums, they produce them, and then they send them out to people in the form of CDs or nowadays as part of iTunes or whatever, various websites. And this spirit has evolved, but it refuses to die. And new generations of punk musicians will undoubtedly continue to emerge. So the spirit of punk music has continued, but it refuses to die. We could also say it's alive and well. We've got new generations of punk musicians. The children of, say, members of the Clash went on maybe to form bands, and now I've got the children of those children, etc. It just continues to go, and this probably upsets parents from generation to generation.
Yeah, it's just a way to be an individual. I see this a lot, especially in high school. I figure it starts in high school and then goes on to college years. But then once you get a job and you settle down, yeah, you don't do a lot of punk after that. Just you kind of conform, you go into the mainstream. Yeah.
You just can't afford to head down to some club and bop around for 2 or 3 hours and lose all your hearing. But it will undoubtedly continue to emerge.
Oh, yeah.
New musicians, of course. Undoubtedly means without a doubt. It's not questioned at all.
It's a surety. Yeah.
Indeed. Undoubtedly, all of you will improve your English when you listen to us and when you listen to our Chinese teacher.
接着第三个空格前面的句子提到 The music was intrinsically linked with punk fashion, which was popularized in London by Saks, a clothing store owned by the Sex Pistols manager. 其实呢，这样子的音乐在本质上是跟朋克的时尚 fashion 相连结的。当时呢，这位 Sex Pistol 的经理呢，他所拥有的一个服饰店就叫做 Sex， 在朋克的时尚界是非常受到欢迎的。而延续这样子的文意呢，我们可以看到第三题选择 sentence C 选项里面提到 In New York City, meanwhile, singer Richard Hell of television was the first to spike his hair, cut up and draw on his t-shirts, and use safety pins to hold his clothing together. 有没有注意到我们这里在讲到呢 The Atlantic 两岸，也就是大西洋的两岸。首先第三个空格前面提到的是伦敦，那么在大西洋的另外一端就是纽约咯。所以在这里的第三题 Sentence C 里面就描述着在纽约另外一个乐团的歌手呢，他在同时 meanwhile 把头发竖立起来，然后割破他的 T-shirt 在上面画画，然后也把衣服用安全别针别在一起，就验证了前面提到的大西洋两岸一起呢实行朋克的摇滚运动。所以第三题的标准答案就选择 C 选项。第四个空格前面提到，其实当时呢，朋克音乐的特征就是他们会聚焦在这个 social and political issues 社会跟政治的议题。那么第四个空格，这次我们要看到后面的句子提到 Joe Strummer of The Clash stated it best when he said punk rock is meant to be our freedom. 这位呢冲击乐团的乐手呢，他说得非常好，他说朋克摇滚就是代表着我们的自由。所以回到第四个空格，我们可以选择 B 选项。Sentence B 里面提到 More than this, however, punk was an expression of individual freedom. 在这里提到呢，其实朋克也是代表着个体自由的一种展现。所以呢，第四题我们就选择 Sentence B 来回应后面提到的代表着自由的意思。接着第五个空格前面的句子提到呢，其实虽然有一些朋克的乐团已经朝主流靠拢了，但是后半句 Punk is at heart an underground do-it-yourself movement in which bands record, produce and distribute their own albums. 其实朋克的本质还是一种地下的自助的运动，而且乐团会自行录制或者是制作，而且发行自己的专辑。延续这样的文意，第五题我们就可以选择 Sentence F. This spirit has evolved. 这样的精神也一再的演变。But it refuses to die, and new generations of punk musicians will undoubtedly continue to emerge. 精神演变，但是拒绝消逝，而新世代的朋克音乐也会持续的出现。OK， 以上就是今天的课文讲解，谢谢收听。
That's it for today, everybody. Thank you for joining us. And hey, head on to the internet and try to listen to some punk songs if your ears can take it. From all of us here at English Digest, my name is Tom.
I'm Stephanie.
Goodbye.
Bye.